Greetings and welcome to Management 431, Recruitment, Selection, and Hiring for New Employees. This is the first lecture, which is on strategic staffing, specifically what does strategic staffing mean, and we'll get into some definitions about that and what we need to do in terms of the types of activities we need to engage in to do strategic staffing. The publishers have put together learning objectives for each chapter and each PowerPoint lecture that we go through. And the basic objectives for this chapter are pretty straightforward. Number one, you want to know why staffing is critical to organizations, why it's important to recruit and hire the best people. You want to also know about why it's important to think about it in a strategic context. For example, how staffing directly relates to the strategy of the company and how we tie those issues together. We also want to talk about the 7 components of strategic staffing, sort of the step-by-step process of what needs to occur in order for strategic staffing to be the most effective. We also want to know how to set appropriate goals, staffing goals. And lastly, we want to be able to figure out how staffing influences and affects all the other areas of human resource management. And we'll go through this step by step. Gaining a competitive advantage in the workplace is essential for organizations to succeed. Now, a competitive advantage can come from all sorts of sources. It can come from having products or services that are unique and different from everybody else. It can come from having good customer service that organizations are able to offer that others can't. It can come from having high quality products. It can come from a whole host of things. But at the core of that competitive advantage is making sure we have employees who can contribute to that competitive advantage. And the way they contribute to it is through creating, enhancing, and implementing new policies and practices and behaviors and services. And by doing this, they are sharing their intellectual property, their knowledge, their gifts, their knowledge, skills, and abilities. They're giving that to the organization to use, and then the organization then utilizes that to be successful, to position themselves to be really competitive in the marketplace and to offer a product or service that consumers want. So in order for us to have good employees who can do this, we need to make sure we have a good staffing process in place, and that's where the strategic staffing system is important and plays its role. So the next slide asks, why is staffing important? And so in order to be able to answer that question, we have to understand how staffing fits into the larger human resource management process. I mean, the goal of staffing is to be able to attract qualified workers to the workplace so that we can then select the right people for the job based on the knowledge and skills and abilities that we need to be able to do that job. From there, we give them all sorts of assessments and we figure out who's the best person. And just because we've determined who the best person is doesn't mean that they will automatically come and work for us. So the last step of that process is attracting them to accept the job offer. And that requires us paying a competitive wage and negotiating a good contract with them and making sure that they're clear what their job responsibilities are so that they're more likely to stay on the job later on. So good staffing means that we've hired the right quality of people that we're looking for and that they are aware of the things that they'll need to do in order to be successful on the job, and that we've matched the skill set that we need with the skill set that the employees or future employees have so that those things match. Staffing then is essential for other activities that go on in HR. For example, we hire good people, but are we hiring people because they fit into the company, or are we hiring them with a particular skill set? Sometimes organizations hire people who will fit into the organization culture, and then they just train them later. And Southwest Airlines is a great example of that. They are more willing to hire someone who they believe will be a good fit into the company culture, and then they worry about training them on those skills at a later date. So, well, except for pilots, and mechanics, which have to have a particular skill set. But those individuals also have to have the right attitude and fit into the Southwest culture, more so than just hiring who might be the best pilot or might be the best mechanic. We want someone that also will fit in and fit in well with our company. So, given that, if we are hiring for culture fit, we need to train them on the job later on. So the kinds of staffing decisions that we make will have an impact on the kinds of training that we may need to do down the line. The better job we do with hiring people who A, have the skill set, B, have the right attitude to work in the organization, the easier it is for us to manage their performance over time. When we don't do a good job managing the staffing process and we recruit people who are less than qualified and we hire people who are less than qualified, we will struggle down the line with performance management issues. Compensation as well, because pay for performance plans are in alignment with people's performance on the job. And if we hire good people and they are trained well and they have the skills to do the job, they will get rewarded through pay for performance systems. But if they don't do a good job, then our challenge is how do we develop them? How do we change their behaviors? How do we get them trained so that they can perform well and ultimately earn the rewards that they want through their compensation system? But all of these systems come into play, even discipline, right? Discipline's an important system that we need to consider. If we don't do a good job hiring people, it makes training difficult, it makes performance management difficult, it makes pay for performance systems difficult, and it increases the likelihood we have to engage in a lot of disciplinary procedures in order to manage those employees well. So, how do we define strategic staffing? In essence, strategic staffing is how we align our staffing practices, our recruitment, our selection process, and our hiring policies so that they are in alignment with the organization's business strategy so that the company can achieve its goals and is as effective as is possible. We can make all sorts of hiring decisions, but we should be making our hiring decisions with an eye towards how this will help the organization achieve its goals and achieve its strategy. So we aren't hiring because of what we did years ago. We're hiring because we need to be more future directed about what we need, not just today, but also for the future. So I might hire somebody who I think can meet today's needs, but also will be able to grow with the company. Most people, when they go to get a job, they're thinking about what their growth opportunities are in the company. They're not just thinking about today and what I can do today, but also how can I grow with this company and learn more? And organizations need to take that same perspective. They want employees who can do the job today, but they also need to be able to be trained and developed and grow with the company as the company grows and changes. And so again, it is with strategic staffing is it's how do we get people into the company, how do we get them to accept the job, and how do we get them to stay with the company long enough for us to gain a good competitive advantage, for them to feel like they've learned something with the job, that we've gained something from their experience here, and then we help them to move on and out as need be. Not every employee stays with a company for their lifetime. They may stay for a few years and then move on to a different company and then work there for a few years too. So, and companies need to accept that people don't stay here cradle to grave. You expect people to stay a few years and then move on to something else. So there's always a low level of turnover that we come to expect. And that's the role that strategic staffing plays in that stuff, is how do we understand turnover and make sure that we are hiring, giving the turnover expectations for our industry and our company. So how does strategic staffing differ from traditional staffing? Because you've heard me talk about strategic, how it links to the corporate strategy. Well, doesn't normal staffing or traditional staffing do that as well? And it does, but to a significantly lesser extent. That is probably a minor consideration when people are hiring. Typically, in a traditional staffing format, the company is being much more reactive. Kind of like the Chicken Little approach. It's like, oh, we have a vacancy, now we need to fill it. And they only think about filling vacancies. They don't think about the kind of planning and forward thinking that needs to be done, because staffing planning really is about looking forward about what we think we might need because we're going into a new innovative industry, or we're developing new products and services, or we want to do something new and we need a different skill set in our employees, and we need to be forward thinking in how we help our employees manage that and be ready for those future opportunities. So strategic staffing is very lightly attached to strategy. It's much more reactive in its approach, and it doesn't really think about how can we improve, how can we be better at finding the best candidates. It's just more about filling a need at a very basic level, and that's it. Now, strategic staffing, as I said, is much more forward thinking. It's about the long-term plan, and I'm not talking about long-term in the next 6 months. I'm talking long-term 2, 3, 5 years from now. Where do we want to be, and how are we going to position our employees to be ready for those kinds of job opportunities? It has to be very tightly aligned with the corporate strategy, so that if our business strategy is arguing that we are differentiation, like Porter's differentiation strategy, then we want to make sure that our hiring is in alignment with that. So we want to hire high-skilled workers. We want to be able to pay them a lot of money. We want to be able to reward them for doing good work and giving them developmental and growth opportunities. Those are the kinds of employees that do best in a differentiation strategy environment. And so our staffing strategies need to match that. Strategic staffing also thinks about staffing in the context of other HR functions. So how does strategic staffing relate to training and development? How does strategic staffing relate to performance management? How does it relate to compensation issues? And so it isn't just about filling a gap. It's about thinking how the people in the organization not only are going to help the company fill the gap, that of a skill that's needed in the moment, but that these people can grow with us and develop with us, that they're going to be high performers, that they're going to be responsive to training, and they're going to do their job well. All these things are things we think about. We also want to make sure our strategic staffing is in alignment with the labor market. So, if we don't have the skill set that we need for people to be successful in our company in the local area, we either recognize we need to train them, or we need to look elsewhere for those skill sets. So knowing what the local labor market can offer really will have an impact on the kind of staffing strategies that we'll engage in order for us to hire and manage the right employees for our company. Strategic staffing also involves targeted recruiting. So as we identify the skill sets that we need, we can, with great precision because of technology, right? We can identify the best workers and enables us to hire them. So we can find where they are, we can reach out to them, we can attract them to the company, and then we can hire them to come in and do the job in the end. So targeted recruiting is really important when we have a very particular skill set that we're looking for. It's also really important when we want to make sure we do diversity hiring. So targeted recruiting not only helps us with a good skill base that we need for our company, the KSAs that we need, but it also helps us to be targeted in expanding on the diversity of our company. So diversity is an important part of that targeted recruiting process. The next couple of things, the last couple of things are really important. Number one, we want to have sound candidate assessment on factors related to job success and long-term potential. So what that means is we need to make sure that the assessments that we use, the selection tools that we use, whether it's interview questions or cognitive ability tests or personality tests, that these are related to current job success and future long-term potential. So our mix of selection tools that we use need to take into account not only success for today, as they start the job, but success for them down the road, over the long haul. And that goes back to that long-term planning window that we need to be thinking about when we do staffing. The last item is about evaluation, right? We set goals for selection, we set goals for recruitment, and we have metrics, as you guys learned in Management 430, that we need to utilize to assess our success in achieving our staffing goals. And so, like you would do in your HR simulation, you set a goal. You want to make sure you were successful in that goal. Were the people you hired, did they have a good morale? Did they have good productivity? Did we do well in terms of training them? Were they responsive to training? All sorts of those factors that we want to consider. So we need to be clear what the outcomes are of staffing, not just the organizational outcomes, but also the outcomes that we expect for staffing. We expect lower turnover and lower absenteeism. We expect higher productivity. And so as we assess those goals, just like you did in the simulation, those are the things that you need to assess as well as part of your staffing strategy. And so good staffing strategy ties in all sorts of metrics to make sure that we are successful, or we can assess whether or not we were successful on the job. And if we're not successful, we need to come up with a plan to adapt and change our process so that we can learn from our mistakes and become more successful down the line. So in terms of what the staffing process looks like, this graphic is a great flow chart of how staffing proceeds, and it also is really clear about the role of the hiring manager versus the role of the HR department itself, and the role that the applicant plays in the process. And so, of course, it all starts with the hiring manager, where the hiring manager sees that there is a need for a position, or there is a gap that needs to be filled. Somebody left the company for whatever reason. It moves on to the human resource department. If it's a new position, clearly a job analysis needs to be conducted to make sure what the job description should include. If it's not a new position, then we want to check in on the job description to see if anything changes, anything new needs to be included. And so if that happens, then we can work on that. Then we get a requisition from the hiring manager. That requisition gives the details of the job, how much they think it will pay, who they report to, what kinds of things we expect them to do. So the hiring manager is responsible for letting HR know through the requisition of what is needed. Then HR's responsibility is sourcing where they're going to find employees and hiring those, and then ultimately making sure they reach the applicants that they want so that they can apply for the job, so that they know whether or not they are minimally qualified to reach that job. Once they apply, once the applicants apply, then the HR department has to screen them. They have to look whether or not they do meet the minimum qualifications. And sometimes, applicants will send resumes in or fill out applications and they're not qualified at all. Even if the qualifications are really clear in the job ad, people will send out job applications because they're desperate for a job. So it is really important to not assume that every applicant who has applied for a position is going to be minimally qualified, because a lot of people will not even read the job qualifications, and they're just going to apply nonetheless because it looks like a job they might like to do. Then they perform your preliminary assessment. They make decisions about which ones they want to interview or apply particular assessments to. They decide who it's going to be. So it then goes back to the applicant. The applicant then takes the tests, is interviewed, or whatever the process is going to be. The Human Resource Department then, after it has assigned those assessments, comes up with the subset of people that they want to consider for the final job. And so once they've done all that pre-screening and they've screened out the candidates they don't think are going to do well, they bring the finalists, however many that might be, to the hiring manager. The hiring manager then has a role in getting to know those finalists and determining which one will be the best person for the job. After that, the hiring manager works with HR to determine who is going to get the offer, and a contingent offer is made. And typically the contingent offer is made because we have to do background checks and drug testing and things like that. After that's done, and assuming that the candidate passes all of that, then the job offer is hopefully accepted, and then they are hired and brought into the company, and we engage in the socialization process, which is something you learn about in your training area. And so when you took Management 430 and they talked about training, or if you have already taken 432, then you are aware of sort of the socialization orientation process that has to occur. So that person has to be integrated into the company culture so they can get up to speed and do their job. And so what I just described is sort of, in narrative, is just sort of following the flow of those boxes and the role that each person plays in that. The hiring manager's job is to identify when they need to hire somebody, get that approved by HR, and then ultimately are involved in the final choices of which candidate they want to bring in. HR handles most of the administrative work. They make sure that there's a good up-to-date job description. They make sure that they source the candidates and then pre-screen them to make sure that they've got people with the minimum qualifications, and then they determine which ones they want to do assessments on, and then ultimately help the hiring manager make that final decision, and then take care of all the administrative stuff like the background checks and things like that. The applicant's job is to ask really good questions, and it's not just about performing well on the job, but it's also about applying for the position and making sure that this company is the right company for them. So they want to be able to ask questions and things like that. They want to be able to perform well, on the assessments, and they need to also determine whether the company is a good match for them, not just whether or not they're a good match for the company. It's a two-way street. It has to go both ways. There are 7 basic components to strategic staffing. The first part of it is the most important, and that's the workforce planning. It's how we determine, based on the strategic direction of the company, how many employees we need to be able to do the jobs. And particularly if we're growing or if we're shrinking, we need to be aware of that. And what skill set is needed, and what level of skill set is needed. So we might need people with high quality skills if we are a differentiation strategy company, or we might be McDonald's and we're looking to hire a fry cook. So we don't need the skills to be that high. But either way, we need to know what skills are needed to be able to be successful in the company, and then we need to develop our plan to hire people with those skills. So part of workforce planning is looking at the direction of the company, where the gaps are, what do we need in order to be successful, and then executing our strategy to meet those goals. After that, we have to source where the talent can be found. So this is about knowing our resources as the recruitment director or the HR manager, knowing what resources are available to us and how we can get or attract those people who have those skills that we want. How can we attract them to our company? So we need to know local markets, we need to know broader regional markets, we need to know national or even global markets depending on the position we're hiring for. Clearly, we don't hire fry cooks for McDonald's from a global market database, right? But we might hire a CEO from a global market database, or a high-level marketing executive. They might need to have skills in the global market that that we could not necessarily find in the local or regional area. And so the higher up we are hiring in the company, the broader and wider the sources are that we need to use. Lower level, entry level positions typically can be filled at a local or regional level, but higher up positions need a more national or global perspective for hiring. Then it's about recruiting. So once we figure out what sources we want to go after, particularly knowing where the skill set can be gained and attained, when we have to actively recruit them, which means we have to develop a plan for reaching them with our recruiting message and then being able to attract them to come into the company. And so it's important that we know how to do good marketing messages, because recruiting is largely marketing. So we have to know how to do targeted recruiting, how to write good messages, making sure that they're legal, but also that they are attractive, and then they're going to attract people to the company. And we want to attract qualified people for the company who will not only apply, but will stay with the company over the long haul, assuming that they get the job offer through the realistic job previews, as we've talked about in Management 430. Then it's about selecting. And selection is about making sure that we assess the candidates on the KSAs that they bring to the table. So if we set certain standards in our workforce planning of a skill set that we're looking for, whether it's sort of a general competency, whether or not they're conscientious or they have a good learning orientation, or whether they have a particular skill set, they know how to use Excel or they know how to do cost accounting, whatever that might be, we then have to assess the candidates to make sure they meet those minimum qualifications. And so that's what the selection process is. And then afterwards, it's about acquiring them. So again, as I said earlier, just because you make an offer to someone doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to accept the job. So it's really important that we figure out how can we persuade the candidate to take the job, at a certain pay level, etc. So we may have to have some flexibility in what we can offer to them in terms of pay. We may have to think about different perks or different other benefits that we could offer them that would keep them attracted to stay with the company. And so sometimes we can do bonuses, or we can offer them a company car, or agree to pay for their MBA, all sorts of things that we can think about. After we acquire them, then we deploy them. We assign them to the position, then we orient them, and we get them up to speed on the job right away. Again, making sure that they have all the skill set and the training and the stuff that they need to be successful. Lastly, it's about retaining them. So we can go through all this work, planning and sourcing and recruiting them and hiring them and deploying them into positions, and then suddenly they leave. And there are many factors that we can't control. But for those factors that we can control, good managers, good resources, making sure we can put money behind our mandates on the job, that they have to do certain things, we need to make sure that they have the resources they need to do their job. So retention of those workers is really important, keeping them safe, making sure they're getting fair pay, making sure they have development opportunities, making sure they have good managers and good coworkers and a good environment to work in. All of those things are really important part of staffing. So they have to have the ability to retain the talent once they go through all the effort and the cost to bring them into the organization in the first place. So let's start with workforce planning, what that means. Basically, it's how the company predicts what the employment needs are going to be, not only today or in the short term, in the next couple of months or the next year, but also over the long haul. For example, if your company is deciding to acquire a new business, then you need to be thinking about how do we merge those new employees into the company and or have to potentially lay some people off. So we may need to decrease the number of employees in our organization. Alternatively, let's say we want to develop a new division. We're deciding to branch into something new and we need to set up a new office somewhere, and so we need to be able to hire people to come in and to be able to do that job. So we really need to know, is the company growing? Is it stabilizing? Is it shrinking? Do we need to bring in new employees? Are we going to need to lay off existing employees because of a merger? And there's all sorts of reasons, why we might need to do any of those. And so the planning process is about the role that the managers play in deciding how many employees we need. And it's really hard work, right? So we need to figure out how many employees I need today, next month, next year, the next couple of years. And as a manager, a sort of a functional manager, not an HR manager, but a functional manager needs to know what needs to be done and how many people they're going to need to be able to do that. That gets reported back to HR, and then HR does the larger workforce planning document. So they can tell top management, we need to grow by 25% in the next 5 years in order to be able to meet the marketing demand that you guys are predicting. So all those things have to be involved. So yes, the hiring manager and the staffing specialist need to be involved in this process. The hiring manager knows the stuff at the grassroots, what needs to be done, and the hiring manager identifies the skills that are needed, and then the staffing specialist is the one that compiles all the organization stats on that. So it has to have both a short-term and a long-term focus, as it says there, because it's not enough to just think about what we need today, but it's also about what we need over the long haul. Next, after planning, as we said, is sourcing and recruiting. And oftentimes sourcing and recruiting goes hand in hand. It happens almost simultaneously. As we source where we can find qualified people and which labor markets they're available, we then identify what's the best way to attract them. So sourcing is just finding where we can secure the employees, and the recruiting process then comes right after that, where we figure out what kind of marketing message that we want to send to them, how do we want to attract them, what things do we want to highlight, what things do we want to downplay, how honest do we want to be with them. Are we going to take a realistic preview approach, or are we going to take a selling approach to the position? And always I recommend a realistic preview approach, because you don't want to mislead people to come into the company, because then you have wasted all sorts of time and money recruiting people who don't really want to stay in the organization anyway. So the goal really of sourcing is figuring out what types of people we need and where we can find those that have the skill set that we need. We determine whether or not they'd be good recruits, and then from there, recruiting attracts them. Recruiting sends them the message and gets them interested in coming to work for our company. The next step after the sourcing and recruiting aspect is selecting and acquiring them. Is giving them the assessments so that we know that we are giving them tests that assess the knowledge, skills, and abilities we expect those candidates to have. And remember, there's all sorts of legal implications in those assessment tools that we use. So understanding your EEO law and the role that it plays in determining which assessment tools we can and should be using, it's really important. So we select those people, and then of course it's the acquiring process. It's like, how do we negotiate the contract? How do we decide what perks or extra bonuses are we going to give this candidate in order to hire them? How much more above our pay grade are we willing to hire to bring in the kind of talent that we want in our organization? So this is a part of the process that can involve the assessment and all the legal issues involved in it, and then the negotiation process once you find the candidate that you want to fulfill the position for you. Next, in terms of deploying talent, it's how do we get them started and up to speed on the job. So we have to consider orientation programs and socialization programs to get them integrated into the company culture right away so that they can do their job and get up to speed as quickly as possible. We also want to be thinking about succession planning issues and career development issues. And this is where there's an overlap between staffing and training, right? We need to be talking to the people who do training and development to make sure we're keeping track of what skill set our new employees have and where they need to grow and develop in order to participate and have a future in the organization's, staffing strategy. And so we work hand in hand with our training and development experts to ensure that the new employees were aware of where their skill sets are and what they're going to need in order to be successful down the line. The last staffing component, as we've discussed, was retaining talent. And retaining talent, of course, is a much larger concept. It involves succession management, career development, but it also means we need to focus on issues of turnover and why people leave companies. And I know that we spend a lot of time on that concept in Management 430, sort of what causes turnover, what are things that management can control, what are things that management can't control. The goal is to keep turnover as low as feasible. It will never be zero, as you remember, because we always want to make sure that we are weeding out poor matches, or weeding out poor employees who are disciplinary issues or legal risks for us. So we want to make sure that we have good turnover. And a good low level of turnover is completely fine. We just don't want our turnover to be too high outside of the norms of our company or the norms of our industry, or the norms of our region, whatever that might be. So if we not only do all the good work to make sure we hire the right people and train them and get them up to speed and orient them properly, we also have to do a good job managing on a daily basis, because otherwise they're going to leave and we have to begin this process all over again. So retention management is a big part of staffing, because it means not only do we want to hire the right people, but we want to keep them over the long haul. The matching process is incredibly important for the hiring system, for the staffing system that we set up, because as I noted before when it came to recruitment, that recruitment and selection is a two-way street. Not only are you trying to attract and assess the best candidate for the job, so you're trying to attract them, they are also testing you. They're also looking to see whether or not this is a company I want to work for. So things that you do during the recruitment process or the hiring process can oftentimes signal employees that this is a good company to work for or a bad company to work for. If you don't treat people well during the recruitment process, that leads them to believe that they will not be treated well if they get hired on the job. So the first thing you have to recognize, it is a two-way street, and it's a matching principle. The employee offers skills and abilities, and they're looking for certain levels of compensation and rewards for their job, and the organization is looking for a particular skill set, and they're willing to pay a certain amount for that skill set. And the goal is to have that match work for both the candidate as well as the organization. The last thing you want is to strong arm somebody into taking a job who you know is not going to be happy on the job. You don't want to hire somebody that you know will not do well on the job or be happy there over the long haul. So it's a dance. It's a dance that the employer and the recruit engage in over time. It's also really important to know that recruitment occurs the entire time that you're involved in the staffing process. It occurs really until they are stable and on the job, because part of the recruitment process, I think, is following through on the promises that you made when you had them as a potential candidate for the company. And so you need to demonstrate to them in those early months that you are going to follow through on what you promised to them. So even though technically recruitment stops once they accept the job offer, the process itself, I think, still continues to some extent, because we have to remember the promises that we made, and we need to make sure we follow through on them so that in 6 months, they're still happy to be at the company and they want to stay there. Because if they're not happy, usually by the first 6 months, they leave and they move on to another company. The last point I think is kind of interesting. Some firms continuously recruit current employees to maintain their attractiveness as an employer and enhance retention. So when you consider that the recruitment process can go longer into the time that the individual is a full-time employee, think about all the things that we need to do to retain them and how important that is. And so when we think about the staffing process, maybe it's not recruitment that lasts that long, but the staffing process is an ongoing relationship. It's an ongoing relationship from the moment that you reach out to them and say, come and apply for a job, until the day that they retire or leave for whatever reason. You're constantly engaged in building and maintaining that relationship with that employee, and that's really important. We have two different types of goals that we want to achieve when we are staffing. The first one is what we call process goals, or the goals that we want to achieve during the hiring process. The second set of goals are the outcome goals, that what we want to achieve after the person is hired. So some of the things that we want to consider during the process is making sure we are attracting a sizable number of qualified candidates. Now, remember, if we're doing realistic recruitment, we're probably not going to attract a wide number of candidates. Our numbers will probably be smaller than one would expect, because if you're doing realistic recruiting, you're only going to attract those who are truly interested in working for your company with those realistic previews. So if you're doing realistic previews, make sure that you are acknowledging that you don't expect to have a broad range of candidates to choose from. You're going to have a small select group that are going to be increased, that is going to have an increased likelihood that they're going to be attracted to and stay with the company if they're hired. Otherwise, we want to just make sure that the pool of candidates we have by and large is attractive and is qualified. So if we find that most of the candidates we have are really not minimally qualified, we need to rethink that marketing message, that recruitment message that we're using. The next issue that we want to make sure in the process is that we're complying with all legal issues and company policy issues. If we have to do affirmative action, we need to make sure that we're complying with affirmative action guidelines. If we have timelines, we need to hire a certain number of people by a certain period of time, that we're sticking to that timeline and that we're communicating that timeline to our candidates. I mean, if we need to hire somebody by December and we start recruiting them in September, we need to let them know that we want to have our hiring done by December, so that this is going to be a longer process. It's not going to be an instantaneous process in terms of making a hiring decision. Some hiring decisions take a lot longer to implement. And then we want to make sure we are being efficient in our efforts, that we're not having to redo and redo and redo hiring efforts because we can't seem to find the right person for the job. Organizations can have a whole range of outcome goals for what they expect after they hire the person. Obviously, we want to make sure we hire a successful employee, someone who can be on the job and is able to do the job properly. We also want to make sure that we are hiring people who want to grow and evolve and be promoted within the company over time. Other goals to think about, we want to make sure we are reducing turnover rates, right? And we don't want to lose high potential or highly qualified workers. And so we need to work on our retention plan and our high potential employee development plan to keep our high potential employees in the organization. We also want to make sure that individuals are aware of how they will be engaged in performance management or training and things like that. So we want to hire individuals for whom the other HR functions will have the desired impacts. We want to hire someone that we know will respond well to training, that will be good performers, who will do good job, get good pay for performance, those kinds of things, that we don't need discipline. Other goals is meeting stakeholder needs, right? If our stakeholders are telling us we need to have greater skill in a particular area, we need to make sure we're training employees to meet those needs. We want to make sure that we are making good hiring cost-effective decisions. So we want to have a good return on investment for the staffing process. You don't want to spend too little, because you may not be able to differentiate between the candidates properly if you don't spend enough money hiring. But you also don't want to spend excessive redundant amounts of money when it comes to staffing somebody, because if you spend too much money, then it's going to take you forever to recoup the investment that it takes to attract and hire the right person. So you're looking for that sweet spot. You want to spend more than a minimal amount of money, but you don't want to spend too much money. And so figuring out where that sweet spot is really important. Other things that we need to consider when we set outcome goals is, how important it is to have a more diverse workforce. If your organization is already struggling with diversity, then diverse hires are going to be really important. You want a flexible organization. So you want to hire people who are adaptable and who can move into different positions and do different skills and have different knowledge bases and are willing to adapt and change as need be. You want to also hire people who can do well with the strategy execution that you want for your company. So if you're a differentiation strategy company, you want to make sure you're hiring people who know how to do good quality work. That's the most important thing. So staffing goals need to be aligned with how we can improve the strategic performance of the organization and making sure that our goals are to improve our staffing system in itself. So every single time that we make a staffing decision, our goal should be, how can we do better? How can we improve? How can we make this a better system, a smoother system, a more effective system, a more efficient system when we're hiring people? I mean, our first and foremost goal in our hiring system is to make sure that we got the competencies, knowledge, skills, abilities, all those things that we're looking for in our candidates, they match what we need for success in the organization and on the job. But it goes more than that. It's also about making sure that those employees can have an impact on the strategic bottom line of the company, that they're going to make a difference, and making sure that they have the competencies needed to not just be successful today, but also over the long haul for the business. And that requires them to be sort of enmeshed with the culture, that they agree with the culture, that they feel like they're a part of that company culture. That's important. And then lastly, that the staffing goals have to be consistent with the goals of the stakeholders in the process. It means that the hiring manager has to be happy, HR has to be happy, the president of the company, if they're involved in the hiring decision, has to be happy, and the applicant has to be happy. Just because you think you've got a great plan, if the applicant isn't going to be satisfied, sometimes you need to rethink the way that you approach your recruiting and your marketing and your hiring processes. We might think we're doing a good job, but in the end, we're doing a disservice to those applicants. We want our applicants to feel like they can thrive in the business, and if we don't present a face that says that they will thrive in the business, it's going to be really hard to attract them and to retain them in the company. This next slide is a really great slide. It gives you an example of the kinds of questions that you want to be thinking about when you're setting your staffing goals. What's the strategy over the next couple of years, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? What talent do they need to have now versus in the future? Do we need to fill this position quickly, or can we wait and hire the best person for the job? Sometimes you need a body, right? Sometimes you need to have somebody, working at the fry cook station at McDonald's, and it needs to be done yesterday. Sometimes you need to have an accounting director, and that accounting director needs to be hired quickly to get up to speed. So some positions, though, we can wait. We don't want to rush a hiring decision for a CEO or maybe even for a key marketing manager position in a certain region where the right person is going to make a difference with the success of the company. So we need to know, these key questions are really good baseline questions to be asking when you're developing your staffing goals for the company. In terms of integrating HR with the other HR functions, in terms of integrating staffing with the other HR functions, we've already talked about this at some basic levels, but obviously we have to decide in our staffing goals, are we going to hire people for the organization culture, or are they going to hire them with a particular skill set? So how much training do we need to do up front to get them ready to work in the company? So we need to let training and development know what skill set people need to have and what kind of training these new employees are going to need. In terms of performance management, people need to know what their performance appraisal is going to be based on, and so they need to know what skills and abilities and competencies they need to focus on to be able to do well on the job. In terms of compensation, it's less about the base pay and much more about pay for performance, all right? And the kinds of benefits that we offer people. So with pay for performance, they need to know what kind of bonuses or increases in pay that they can expect given a certain level of performance, whether or not they can expect bigger bonuses or smaller bonuses. Next is succession planning, and can we expect employees to know whether or not they're ready for promotion. So good succession planning systems assess people's skills, assess where the gaps are, what skills they need so that they are ready to be promoted to the next level at a certain period of time. And then of course, recruitment impacts all those selection activities, because if you don't do a good job recruiting, you're going to have a much harder job at the selection and deployment of employees stage. So good, solid recruiting makes selection a piece of cake. So the better job we do in the recruiting aspect of things, the easier it is for us to do selection downstream. This last slide is a great resource of all sorts of different websites that can help you and support you when it comes to staffing efforts. Number one, the EEOC, and make sure that you're aware of all the legal issues that are involved in doing HR, and particularly hiring and recruiting people. Then you've got the Electronic Recruiting Exchange, where you can learn more about recruiting issues and access recruiting sources. The Human Resource Planning Society, HRPS, helps us to do better forecasting of needs and makes us aware of what labor market availability is out there. ONET gives us really good guidelines on baseline job descriptions, so we know the KSAs needed to do particular jobs. The Society for Human Resource Management is also our professional organization, and they've got resources for all HR topics, but specifically if you need help, guidelines, support in selection tools that are available, or recruitment best practices in recruitment and selection, SHRM is a great repository of that information, and they'll share that info with you. And they also give you networking opportunities with local and regional groups. Staffing.org is also one that helps us with staffing needs. And then World at Work addresses union-based issues. So I recommend reviewing all of these resources and proceeding from there in terms of understanding how you can improve recruitment and selection and staffing issues in organizations. That's the last slide, and thanks very much. Look forward to talking to you soon.